We loved them, trusted them completely. When these 10 Hollywood legends smiled on our TV screens, they defined what it meant to be a perfect gentleman or a devoted father. But the moment the director yelled cut and they headed home, the script changed completely, behind closed doors, away from the cameras. These beloved icons were no heroes. They were tyrants, and the families who lived with them paid a terrifying price just to keep that illusion alive. Number 1, Sean Connery. When he lit that cigarette at the baccarat table in Dr. No, he just introduce a character. He handed the 1960s an entirely new blueprint for masculinity. He was the suave, untouchable protector in a tailored tuxedo for millions of viewers across Britain, America. Connery was the ultimate gentleman, a man who always knew exactly what to say and exactly how to command a room with just a smirk. But that effortless composure was strictly for the cameras. Behind the heavy doors of his private life, the script was entirely different. The women who actually lived with him faced a man who believed physical intimidation was simply a standard domestic tool. The reality of living with Sean Connery was perhaps best documented by his first wife, the actress Diane Silento. In her memoir, she described a marriage defined not by Hollywood glamour, but by walking on eggshells around a deeply volatile temper. She detailed a daily reality of psychological control, and sudden aggressive outbursts had left her locking herself in rooms for her own safety. Silento wasn't dealing with a charming secret agent. She was dealing with a man who used fear to maintain his dominance at home. What makes Connery's history so distinct is just what happened in private. It's how casually he defended his mindset on the public record. In a now infamous 1965 interview with Playboy magazine, right at the absolute peak of his global fame, he stated quite plainly that he didn't think there was anything wrong with hitting a woman. He argued that an open-handed slap was entirely justified if a woman was being, in his words, provocative. This wasn't a careless slip of the tongue. More than 2 decades later, in 1987, Barbara Walters sat across from him on national television and asked if he still held that view. Without a hint of hesitation or regret, he confirmed he hadn't changed his mind. He would go on to repeat the exact same sentiment to Vanity Fair in the 1990s. This was an A-list superstar who felt completely comfortable justifying physical control over women into a microphone. And for a very long time, the public and the entertainment industry simply let it slide. The world was too invested in the myth of the rugged, no-nonsense Scottish icon to look closely at a man whose force was an acceptable way to win argument with his wife. The studios sold us the fantasy of a hero who only used his fists against villains. The truth is, his demand for absolute submission didn't stop when the director yelled cut. It just moved into his living room. Number 2. Peter Sellers. When you picture Peter Sellers, you almost inevitably see the trench coat, the hat, and the absurd mustache of Inspector Clouseau. He was the bumbling, utterly harmless genius of the Pink Panther, a man whose unparalleled physical comedy and brilliant voice work brought a specific kind of effortless joy to millions of living rooms across America and Britain. On screen, he seemed like a man constructed entirely out of jokes, someone who didn't possess a single threatening bone in his body. You looked at him and just expected to laugh. But when the camera stopped rolling and he went home, the comedy vanished completely. The man waiting behind closed doors wasn't funny. He was, by the accounts of those who lived with him, absolutely terrifying. To his family, Peter Sellers was a deeply paranoid, relentlessly controlling presence who turned their daily lives into a psychological minefield. The Swedish actress Britt Ekland, his second wife, didn't experience the quirky genius the public adored. Instead, she found herself trapped in a suffocating environment defined by his intense jealousy and explosive, unpredictable rages. Her reality was one of constant anxiety. Sellers would fly into sudden furies, destroying property and screaming, creating an atmosphere of sheer intimidation to keep her in line. He maintained a quiet, relentless campaign of psychological control. Ekland later detailed how he micromanaged her existence, dictating what she was allowed to wear, who she was permitted to speak to, and how she was supposed to behave in public. He used his immense fame and influence to isolate her, breaking down her independence while presenting the picture of a glamorous celebrity couple to the rest of the world. This climate of fear extended directly to his children. His son, Michael, eventually wrote about a childhood spent walking a perpetual tightrope, always trying to survive his father's random, calculated cruelty. Sellers didn't he just lose his cool when things got tense? He went out of his way to torment his own family, sometimes freezing them out over imaginary slights, only to demand absolute submission when he decided to let them back in. Back then, the entertainment press brushed off his dark moods as the necessary quirks of a tortured artist. Protecting the brand of a comedy icon was just easier than looking too closely at the damage he did behind closed doors. But quirks don't explain systematically breaking down a wife's self-esteem, or the raw terror he drilled into his own kids. Sellers hid behind his mask of a lovable clown, using his public brilliance as a shield while waging a private war on the people who loved him. Number 3. George C. Scott. George C. Scott, standing before that massive American flag as General Patton, remains one of the most unforgettable images in movie history. He owned the screen with a gravelly voice and fierce, undeniable authority. To audiences in the 1970s, Scott was the heavyweight champ of serious acting. A man of such tough principles, he refused his Academy Award, famously calling the Oscars a meat purer. He projected raw strength and absolute control. You saw a man who would never bend, but that iron control was a total illusion. Once the cameras cut and the heavy drinking started, the principled actor vanished. In his place was a volatile, unpredictable man who used his huge size and booming voice to inflict terror instead of commanding respect. The most terrifying proof his off-screen reality came from Hollywood royalty. Ava Gardner. When they got together, Gardner realized she had not found a strong protector. She had walked straight into a trap. In her autobiography, she detailed how Scott's drunken rages turned her daily life into a desperate fight to survive. He did not just have a bad temper, he was dangerously violent. During one sudden, explosive episode, the beating was so brutal it left Gardner with a broken collarbone and a detached retina. She eventually had to run for her life and leave him completely. This was not some one-off tragedy. Scott's volatile domestic behavior was a relentless pattern spanning decades, multiple marriages. His marriage to acclaimed actress Colleen Dewhurst, whom he wed and divorced twice, was famously turbulent. Defined by severe alcoholism and explosive outbursts, he ran households on pure fear, where partners constantly monitored his mood and sobriety. Knowing the slightest shift could trigger a dangerous physical clash, the man who played brilliant war heroes on screen was actually running a brutal dictatorship inside his own home. Yet the entertainment industry mostly looked the other way. Hollywood had a bad habit of excusing abuse by calling it artistic intensity. Producers and directors traded stories about how incredibly difficult he was on set, but the extreme danger he posed to the women under his roof was just an unspoken footnote. Studios actively guarded his status, keeping his reputation as an American icon completely spotless. They let audiences keep worshipping the strong, authoritative leader on the silver screen, shielding everyone from the reality of the violent man waiting in the dark. Number 4. Rex Harrison. If you walked into a movie theater in 1964 to watch My Fair Lady, you saw Rex Harrison as the peak of British sophistication. Playing Professor Henry Higgins, he was arrogant, sure, but he was also incredibly charming. He wore sharp tweed, had a quick wit, and sang sweet songs about getting used to a woman's face. To millions of moviegoers in both Britain and America, he was the ultimate upper-class gentleman, elegant and refined. But behind closed doors, that famous charm totally vanished. The actor playing harmless aristocrats had a much darker nickname among the Hollywood press corps: Rex the Hex. Harrison did not need to throw a physical punch to break the people around him. His tool of terror was a cold, systematic psychological warfare. He was incredibly vain and casually cruel, demanding complete devotion from his wives while tearing them down constantly. Being married to Rex Harrison meant being slowly broken down, day after day, by a man who saw his wives as completely disposable. This was not just a case of a bad marriage. The emotional trap he built was deeply dangerous. Glamorous actress Carole Landis learned this the hard way. During their intense affair, Harrison's cold mind games and his cold dismissal put a crushing psychological weight on her. When they split, the emotional pain proved fatal. She just didn't survive his harsh rejection. You would think a tragedy that massive would force a man to reflect. It didn't. Years later, the incredibly talented Welsh actress Rachel Roberts married him, only to face the exact same suffocating abuse. Harrison slowly chipped away at her self-worth with calculated disdain, pushing her into a severe state of instability. Once he got tired of her and walked out, Roberts went into a massive emotional freefall. Pushed to the absolute edge by the toxic relationship, she also met a tragic end after the marriage collapsed. Two brilliant women were completely crushed under the weight of this one man's cruelty. Yet, Hollywood barely paused to ask questions. Harrison just kept landing leading roles, winning awards, and smiling for the cameras. The studios knew all about the trail of destruction he left behind, but they protected his box office power anyway. They let the public keep cheering for this charming gentleman, all while burying the wreckage he caused the second he stepped off stage. Number 5. Jerry Lewis. Every Labor Day weekend for decades, millions of American families gathered in front of their televisions to watch Jerry Lewis cry. He was the tireless host of that annual telethon, sweating through his tuxedo for 21 straight hours, begging for donations to save sick kids. To the public, he wasn't just a comedy legend, he was a living saint. He seemed like a sweet, goofy humanitarian who cared about vulnerable kids more than anyone else in show business. But the man begging for compassion for other kids on V showed absolutely none to his own sons. The second the cameras stopped rolling, and he got home to his Bel Air mansion, the lovable clown vanished. Behind closed doors, Lewis ruled like a terrifying, aggressive dictator. His first wife, Patty Palmer, didn't live with a comedy genius. She lived in constant fear. Throughout their marriage, Lewis subjected her to extreme psychological pressure and strict financial control. He kept her completely isolated and dependent, creating an environment where his explosive, unpredictable rages ruled the entire house every single day. When Palmer finally filed for divorce, after 36 years, the court papers painted a dark picture. She cited extreme cruelty, pulling back the curtain on a man who used his fame and money to completely control her. But the heaviest toll of his domestic abuse fell right on his own sons. The children of America's favorite family entertainer grew up paralyzed by a constant, heavy fear of their father. Years later, they admitted their childhood felt like a hostage situation. Lewis didn't just discipline his boys, he straight up terrorized them. They recalled brutal physical beatings, detailing how he used a leather belt to demand absolute obedience. These kids had to constantly monitor his erratic mood swings, knowing one wrong word could trigger a violent outburst. What makes this so hard to digest is the shield he built to protect his image. Jerry Lewis basically weaponized his own charity work. It created a massive blind spot for the public and the press. How could anyone accuse a man who raised hundreds of millions of dollars for sick children? His massive public charity work made his private abuse completely untouchable. He used his status as a beloved national hero as a shield, making sure the cameras only focused on the tears he cried for strangers, while the people who actually shared his last name had to survive his rage all on their own. Number 6. Richard Burton. When you heard this man speak, you felt the weight of a classically trained genius. He possessed the absolute most famous voice in Britain, a deep, commanding baritone that could make reading a phone book sound like a masterpiece. In the 1960s, alongside Elizabeth Taylor, he was part of the ultimate Hollywood royal couple, sold as the definition of epic, globe-trotting romance. Dripping in diamonds, stepping off yachts, and radiating a love so intense it almost melted the screen in Cleopatra. But once the paparazzi went home and the heavy drinking started, that beautiful romance turned into a total nightmare. The public was sold a glamorous myth about passionate fights between lovers. Behind closed doors, the reality was brutal domestic violence. Burton had a profound, alcohol-induced split personality, creating a daily nightmare where his household never knew which version of him would walk through the door. When he drank, the brilliant Shakespearean actor completely vanished, replaced by a violent, destructive monster who totally lost control. He did not just fight with his wife, he used his brilliant mind to systematically shred her self-esteem. And when words failed, the violence turned physical. Elizabeth Taylor often had to show up on movie sets or in public in heavy makeup and dark sunglasses, desperately trying to cover up the bruises from his drunken rages. He routinely turned high-end hotel suites into absolute war zones, smashing furniture and leaving behind a path of total ruin for others to quietly sweep away. What makes Burton's legacy so dark today is how Hollywood publicists repackaged his violence to protect his star status. Instead of calling it what it was, assault, the media spun his abuse as just the side effect of a wild, artistic temperament. Gossip rags simply called their marriage tempestuous. They framed the fistfights as creative clashes between two giant egos, as if beatings were just the way passionate geniuses communicated. The studios and reporters essentially romanticized a deeply toxic, abusive marriage. They gave Burton a free pass, letting him hide his cruelty behind the label of a tortured, hard-drinking genius. Fans were told to drool over the $1 million diamond rings he bought her to say sorry, while everyone ignored the terror of the woman who actually had to wear them. Number 7. Desianas. If you turned on a TV set in the 1950s, you probably spent hours in Ricky Ricardo's living room. As the star and mastermind of I Love Lucy, Desianas did not just play a husband. He literally helped build the concept of the American sitcom family with his trademark conga drum and quick smile. He was the stressed but deeply devoted patriarch. Week after week, tens of millions of viewers watched impatiently deal with his wife's wild schemes. Together, they represented the gold standard of 1950s domestic bliss. But the second the studio audience stopped clapping, that perfect household vanished completely. Being married to Desianas was absolutely nothing like a sitcom. It was a draining, deeply terrifying ordeal. When Lucille Ball finally filed for divorce in 1960, the court papers shattered the beautiful illusion they spent 10 years building. She did not just cite standard differences. She charged him with extreme mental cruelty. The guy who seemed so patient and warm on screen was, behind closed doors, consumed by heavy drinking and sudden violent rages. Anas did not just drink too much. His explosive anger controlled the mood of the entire house. When he got drunk, his anger turned destructive. He would rampage through the house in terrifying outbursts, smashing furniture and leaving his family in total panic. Lucille Ball and their young kids had to walk on eggshells daily, never knowing what tiny trigger would set off his next violent explosion. The house that should have been their safe space was actually a psychological minefield. What makes this so shocking now is how systematically the industry covered it up. Anas and Ball were not just actors. They ran Dezelu, which was one of the most powerful production empires in TV history. TV executives, advertisers, and reporters all made too much money off his clean image. For years, the press buried reports of his violent outbursts and constant cheating, spinning their obvious marital problems as normal stress from running a massive television studio. Hollywood let him make a fortune selling the fantasy of a perfect marriage to America, while using a small army of publicists to hide how he was destroying his actual family. He built a historic career on the illusion of a happy home, while turning his real household into a zone of constant fear. Number 8. Errol Flynn. When he swung across those pirate ship sails in Captain Blood, or drew his sword as Robin Hood, he basically defined what a Hollywood action hero was. He was the ultimate charming rogue, completely fearless and impossibly handsome. For movie fans back in the 1930s and 40s, Flynn was the king of adventure. He was the hero who fought for justice, beat the bad guys, and always protected the leading lady. But that on-screen chivalry was just a well-rehearsed costume. The second he stepped off the Warner Brothers lot, that clean-cut protector vanished without a trace. In his place was a guy who treated absolute cruelty not as a flaw, but as a lifestyle choice. His marriage to glamorous French star Lily Dumiter was anything but a passionate Hollywood romance. It was a brutal, never-ending war zone. Flynn lived in a haze of heavy, non-stop drinking, throwing his violent rages directly at his wife every single day. Gossip columns back then tried to paint their marriage as just fiery or passionate, but there is nothing romantic about living in terror. Whenever Flynn flew into one of his drunken rages, their house turned into a seriously dangerous place. He used his size to threaten control and physically hurt her, leaving her constantly on edge, waiting for the next blow-up. Dumiter was not just dealing with a moody actor, she was surviving a man who felt entitled to wreck their house and tear her down whenever he pleased. And this violent, predatory streak did not stop at home. It followed him all over Los Angeles. But the worst part of Errol Flynn's story is how the Hollywood studios actively covered for his violence. Warner Brothers had a massive prom machine, and they used it constantly to clean up his messes. They hid police reports, controlled the media, and shut up anyone who tried to speak out. Instead of calling him out, the whole industry basically cheered his toxic behavior. They spun his cruelty as just the harmless antics of a Hollywood bad boy. They even turned his predatory habits into a catchy phrase, in like Flynn, selling his total lack of boundaries as a joke. The studio built a wall around him to keep his star power safe, letting audiences keep cheering for his heroic outlaws on screen, all while hiding the fact that they were funding a monster who kept his worst abuse for the women locked behind his closed doors. Number 9. Bing Crosby. When Bing Crosby sang those opening notes of White Christmas, he did not just make a hit record. He became the ultimate dad of mid-century America, leaning back with his pipe, using that smooth voice to project a sense of deep, comforting warmth to millions watching his Christmas specials. Crosby was the perfect picture of a kind, loving father. He was the voice the whole country trusted, playing in almost every living room across America during the holidays. But that relaxed attitude was just a carefully crafted mask. The second he stepped inside his own house, that warm, smiling dad vanished. He became a cold, strict dictator who ruled his family with absolute, terrifying control. The truth about life with Bing Crosby came out when his oldest son, Gary, wrote a book that completely destroyed the Hollywood fantasy. Crosby did not have the wild, drunken blow-ups of other stars back then. His cruelty was much more cold-blooded because it was completely sober and planned out. He expected total perfection and obedience from his kids, backing up his extreme rules with brutal physical beatings. He often used a heavy, studded belt to keep them in line, leaving his boys feeling unloved and totally paralyzed by the constant fear of making one wrong move. This dark mood did not just hurt the kids. His first wife, Dixie Lee, was completely cut off under his strict rule, drowning under the mental strain and the emotional wall he put up between them. She turned to heavy, non-stop drinking just to survive the suffocating life inside her own house. What makes Crosby's past so disturbing is the huge gap between the real man and his public image. The media and the studios did everything to protect the Bing Crosby money train. Reporters ignored how miserable his family was, making sure people kept buying his music and watching his shows. He got rich off the idea of family values, while reporters looked away as he slowly tore his own family apart. The deep mental scars he left haunted his kids for decades. Growing up under his brutal rule left deep, permanent wounds, leading to tragic personal downfalls long after they finally got out of his house. And we are still told to find comfort in his songs every December, totally blind to the fact that for the people who shared his last name, he brought nothing but fear. Number 10. Oliver Reed. When Oliver Reed dominated the screen, movies like Women in Love or Gladiator, he brought a dangerous, raw energy that almost nobody else could match. He was Britain's ultimate movie tough guy. For decades, people absolutely loved his real-life reputation as the ultimate hellraiser. People loved watching him swagger onto late-night TV, heavy glass in hand, telling outrageous stories with a mischievous, charismatic glint in his eye. The public bought the lovable rogue act, a guy who just lived life larder, drank harder, and had this wild, untamed spirit. But that lovable hellraiser was a total myth, kept alive by a media that cared more about ratings than reality. The man waiting for his partners when the pub doors finally locked was flat out terrifying. When the heavy drinking took over, Reed did just get loud or eccentric. He turned into a highly aggressive, violent, and deeply paranoid figure. His first wife, Kate Bond, found herself trapped in a marriage ruled by severe emotional volatility and sudden, terrifying physical outbursts. He ran his home through pure intimidation and jealousy. He subjected the women in his life to brutal psychological pressure, isolating them and demanding total submission. The partners who actually lived with him never saw the charming gentleman the talk show hosts laughed with. Instead, they had to survive a controlling man who used his massive size to keep them in constant, suffocating fear. What makes Reed's legacy so disturbing today is how eagerly the British entertainment industry cheered him on. TV producers knew exactly how volatile and destructive his alcoholism really was, but they still booked him on live broadcasts, actively hoping he would get belligerent on air. They basically funded and applauded a man whose unchecked aggression was destroying the women in his private life. Tabloids and show hosts just called him a proper lad. They laughed off his dangerous behavior as colorful or unpredictable. By treating his violent instability as an entertaining punchline, the media gave him the perfect cover for his domestic tyranny. They let the public keep cheering for a sanitized caricature, ignoring the trail of collateral damage he left behind. And though his larger-than-life career ended it abruptly on a movie set in Malta, the industry made sure his cruelty stayed buried in the shadows long before the final screen faded to black. Number 11. Cary Grant. If you wanted to define the word sweeve back in the mid-20th century, you only needed 2 words. Cary Grant, with his sharp-tailored suits and that unplaceable mid-Atlantic accent and his effortless magnetic charm, he was the gold standard for a Hollywood leading man. In hits like North by Northwest and To Catch a Thief, he projected pure, sophisticated romance. He wasn't just an actor, he was the symbol of elegance for decades, Audiences believed he was the perfect gentleman, incapable of a single ugly thought. But the Cary Grant on the big screen was a carefully constructed lie. The moment the director yelled cut and he went home, that charming gentleman vanished. The man behind closed doors was driven by deep paranoia and an obsessive, terrifying need for absolute control. The grim reality of his home life came to light through his fourth wife, actress Diane Cannon. When she married him, she didn't get a Hollywood romance. She walked into a controlled psychological prison. Grant didn't just want a wife. He demanded someone to mold, micromanaging her entire life. He dictated what she wore, how she had to speak, and who she was allowed to talk to. His massive fame and sharp intellect became weapons to belittle her, chipping away at her independence until she felt completely isolated. What makes Grant's cruelty so disturbing was how he weaponized his own deepest insecurities. During their marriage, he grew obsessed with using lust as a form of psychiatric therapy. But he didn't keep these drug trips to himself. He pressured his young wife into joining those highly volatile sessions. He used the mind-altering effects of the drug not to heal her, but as a weapon to break down her mind and rebuild her to his exact specifications. Cannon later shared how this endless pressure and forced her tripping pushed her to the edge of a mental breakdown. When he wasn't playing mind games, his explosive temper kept the house in constant, suffocating fear. He would fly into sudden rages, using his physical size to intimidate her and demand complete obedience. Switching from icy silence to terrifying fury in seconds, he kept her on edge, and yet the entertainment industry refused to look closely. The studios just couldn't let go of Cary Grant's image as the ultimate unbothered gentleman. Reporters looked the other way during his marriage's obvious collapse, protecting his box office draw at all costs. They let him keep smiling in his spotless tuxedos, completely shielded by his own legend, while he slowly broke down the sanity of the woman trapped in his home. Number 12. Charlie Chaplin. When Charlie Chaplin waddled onto the screen, twirling his cane and adjusting his tiny bowler hat, he didn't just make audiences laugh. He made them care for a world recovering from war and entering the Great Depression. Chaplin was the ultimate symbol of humanity. He was the innocent, a kind-hearted underdog who stood up to bullies and protected the vulnerable. During the silent film era, he was probably the most famous, beloved man on the planet. But that deep empathy he showed on camera was completely missing in his real life. The champion of the defenseless on screen was, in reality, a brutal tyrant who aggressively went after and completely controlled these vulnerable, incredibly young women. The darkest, most well-documented chapter of his cruelty at home involves his second wife, Lita Grey. She was only a teenager when they married. Totally overwhelmed by the most powerful man in early Hollywood, Chaplin didn't see her as a partner. He saw her as property. Her life was no funny fairy tale. It was a suffocating nightmare of extreme paranoia and constant emotional mind games, and absolute control over her entire day. When she finally escaped the marriage in 1927, her 42-page divorce filing ruined his lovable image for anyone who read it. These weren't just complaints about a tough husband. They detailed a deeply dangerous man. Grey explained how Chaplin put her through constant, calculated mental abuse. She lived in constant terror, describing times he waved a loaded gun around the house, using that weapon not as a casual threat, but as a clear tool to force her into silence and surrender. He used his massive wealth and smarts to keep her isolated, terrified, and totally dependent on his unstable moods. But the massive scale of Chaplin's fame acted like a bulletproof shield. The public just couldn't match that sweet, bumbling tramp with the man terrorizing a teen bride behind locked doors. Even though the divorce caused a massive scandal, the Hollywood industry and his loyal fans stepped in to protect his genius. They brushed off his calculated cruelty as nothing more than the tragic, complicated quirks of an artistic genius. Chaplin built a multi-million-dollar empire on the idea of standing up for the little guy. He wanted the world to cry over his fictional struggles, but the moment he stepped inside his own home, he used every bit of his massive influence to show the women trapped with him had absolutely no voice at all.